This was a very particular and specific gang approach, collective approach by a group of predominantly Pakistani men to white girls. There's no point saying, yes, but what about Catholic priests? They've also abused children. Yes, well, that's why we know that there was a Catholic church abuse scandal, right? We called it for what it was. That didn't mean that the only people who's ever abused a child are Catholic priests. And it also didn't mean that every Catholic priest was an abuser, right? But we did understand it was a particular problem in the Catholic Church or in the Church of England. And this is a particular type of offence for very specific reasons. So it's one of the reasons why the Labour government at the moment are under so much pressure, because they've tried to say, oh, we've already looked at this. We've got the J report, which is a very general, broad report that does not specifically look at the grooming gang. And the big thing for me is the cover-up.
Take the first step towards online privacy. Get NordVPN.
When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes a duty. So said Thomas Jefferson. Go to bit.ly/lawful-tax-protest or bit.ly/make-war-history and find out why it is a criminal offence to pay central government or local government taxes in the UK. And let's make war history. I am joined by a member of the House of Lords, and in this video we're going to be talking about all the craziness that's going on in the UK and what we can do about it. Hi everybody, this is Rich. I'm joined by Baroness Claire Fox. Before I introduce her, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, CryptoRichYT, join my official Telegram announcements channel, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please come and support my work on censorship-resistant platforms. Come and watch me on ODYSEE and also on Rumble. Links in the description below. Hi, good morning, Baroness Fox, and just for the sake of protocol, public protocol, I did ask you whether I should call you Baroness or Lady, and you said Claire. So thank you so much, Claire, for coming on. And just like a tiny little bit about you. You were a BBC presenter. You were a member of the Communist Party. You then joined the Brexit Party at some point and campaigned for Brexit. And you're now an independent life peer in the House of Lords. And your political journey matches my own. So moving from the left to a sort of independent position, because I don't think that left and right apply anymore. It's authoritarianism versus anti-authoritarianism now. So thank you.
That's fine. Just a slight correction, which was I was a revolutionary communist, even more dramatic. But that meant that I was a Trotskyist rather than a Stalinist, and I wasn't a BBC presenter, but I was a regular on BBC, particularly on Radio 4 for many years before the Brexit years ate me up in cancellation.
Yes. Well, a revolutionary communist party member who then becomes a Brexiteer definitely needs to be cancelled. I joke with you, okay? Because you and I think we share the same view with regards to censorship. And it's interesting you say that you were a Trotskyist and not a Stalinist, because we actually do have a Stalinist as our Prime Minister, Keir Starlin, with his Stalinist policies. And if we just go through, and feel free to add, like the stuff that's coming at us, that this Stalinist government are rolling out. There's the assault on farmers, destroying food production, just like Stalin did. There's the censorship through the online, I don't even know what it's called now, the online speech bill. There's the overreach in terms of where the state will have more say on what happens to children than parents do. And which is also Stalinist, and this is the Children's Wellbeing Bill. What else is there that they're doing? There's the Climate and Nature Bill that we've got to look forward to.
Well, I mean, I think that, I slightly differ with that approach, because I actually don't think Keir Starmer is a Stalinist. I think actually the problem with the Labour government is that they're technocrats, they're managerial technocrats with certain political prejudices. But I mean, I almost wish they were ideological, because then you could engage with them, right? Then you would have some ideas through which you could have any kind of a debate or discussion, whereas they lack that depth, which is one of the things that makes them most dangerous, because they perform at the level of, it really is like the computer says no. You cannot, they're like machine politicians with no hinterland whatsoever. I think that their instincts, though, are entirely to believe that the state knows best. That is definitely their instincts. But as a kind of sign of the time, a lot of the things which they're doing, the Online Safety Act, is the name of the act, and I fought against it when it was in the House of Lords, when it was just a bill. They're going to deepen it, but it was a product of the Conservative Party. So, they're carrying on in that tradition. Even their work in relation to education, which is going to be so damaging in terms of schools, and they're going to, effectively get rid of the academies and the independence associated with schools. They're going to undermine knowledge-rich education. But their work on homeschooling, just as an example, was already introduced. I've had those arguments in the Lords against the Conservatives when they were in government. So it's an indication of the fact that the political parties, in terms of the mainstream, share a lot of the same prejudices. And at the moment, I'm involved in having a big fight with the government over, of all things in the world, the football governance bill, which is going to have a very powerful regulator that will have the power to remove licenses from any football team that does not adhere to the rules set down by the government. And you think, that is surely Stalinist. That shows you what Labour's like. But guess what? They inherited that bill from the former administration, the Conservative government, right? Who came up with this football governance bill. So I think it's an indication of, A, what you were saying about left and right don't work anymore. But this instinct that the state will have more power is one which is shared, sadly, and that everything should be overregulated is shared by all the political parties.
Click, thank you for saying that. I'm going to throw something at you cautiously. I'm still going to say it, right? But it seems to me that this is what's been going on ever since lockdown, and it's happened internationally, where we have a uniparty. Ireland, Germany, France, the US under the Democrats, the UK, whether it's a Tory or Labour, instituting the same sort of statist policies, which match the Agenda 2030 and the WEF. One of the things that I said on my channel with regards to the Tory party, when Sunak came in, I said he's going to do such an awful job, but completely betray Conservative Party ethos and hand Keir Starlin, a massive majority, an unassailable majority, which is what's happened. And one of the examples of that is during Rishi Sunak, during the campaign, saying, "Oh, we're going to bring in conscription." Like, that's a vote winner. So I'm asserting that where this is all driving us to, whether it was Rishi Sunak's WF policies or Keir Starmer's WF policies, is we're going to be hungry, own nothing, and apparently that's going to make us.
But I completely disagree with this. I do not share your outlook on this at all. I mean, I don't think it's got anything to do with the WEF. I don't think it started around lockdown. I think it started a lot earlier than that, and I think it actually started, if anything, around once we got to a situation where you have got the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is a very long time ago, but which nonetheless meant that we got into a situation, I mean, like many millions of people, I was delighted to see the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the authoritarian associated with that bloc. But what then happened was that we got into a situation where the political parties had defined themselves all over the West as being, well, at least we're not as bad as those people over in the East, because people would regularly, the notion was that we were the free West and that was the repressive East. And then they were left with this situation of having to say, as Margaret Thatcher very infamously put it, there is no alternative. And that gave a sort of impetus to this notion that there was only one way of organising society. And ideologically, the market became the thing. And then they gave up in the West, particularly, and this is very crude historically, but there was an abandonment of this notion that you had to really fight for and define and defend what Western values were, and that all that you needed to do was tinker around and manage the economy for the best. And that kind of gutted ideologically the political parties from, I mean, that's one of the big reasons why left and right don't mean anything. Now, as it happens, it all started a lot earlier than that, but that's sort of broadly it. I disagree with this WEF. I mean, I think they're irrelevant to the way the world is working, and I know that we disagree on that. They simply reflect some of these themes rather than they create them. And I also, in the more modern, more recent circumstances, I think that what's happened is there's been a broadly speaking, a populist rebellion against post-war political arrangements that are no longer fit for purpose. And that expressed itself around Brexit in the UK in 2016. It obviously happened in America around Trump getting elected, because the first time Trump was elected, he might have been elected as a Republican, but nobody associated him with the Republican Party in a traditional sense.
Mm.
And all throughout Europe, we've seen mainstream political parties just collapsing, one after another. And every time, the kind of liberal elites in Europe, something will happen and they'll say, oh, the grown-ups are back in the room, a sensible party's been elected. Within months, there's been some kind of populist uprising. So things have just changed. And I think that what we're going through historically is one of those great shifts that hasn't worked itself out yet, which is the arrangements that had been in place that held society together are not able to contain the forces of history. People feel that they've been done to for many years. I mean, that's the most visceral experience, that they're on the receiving end. They've not been taken seriously as, autonomous, subjective citizens who can make their own decisions. They're patronized. It's not even rich and poor, but if you haven't got much power, you were still in a democracy considered to be equal at the ballot box. But they behaved as though people were not equal. And there's explicit emergence of this sort of, we know best what we should. You use the example of parents. We even know how to parent your children better than you do. And people just, really viscerally have responded to that. And I think one of the reasons why Brexit was such a popular vote in 2016, it was a very conscious rejection of the EU. But
Yes.
part of that rejection was the notion of national sovereignty and the assertion of people saying, we know best what's in our interest. We don't want that to be imposed on us from Europe. And now what we're seeing is a recognition by people that they don't want that imposed either in a top-down fashion by even a sovereign government here in the UK, because the temperamental attitude of the governing elites, whether that's Conservative or Labour, is still that they know best, and they try and ring fence away decision making from ordinary voters all the time.
Yes, absolutely. And you just reminded me of how on Friday, we're recording this on Monday, the 13th of January, but on Friday, I can't remember exactly, 15 or 17 councils have said that they're not going to be holding elections that were due in May, thus disenfranchising 10 million voters and and those councillors just giving themselves an extra 4 years. Oh, we'll just run things for another 4 years. All part of the government's, in order to support the government's plan for devolution, which I actually think is misnamed in a very Orwellian style, because it's actually going to result in increasing centralization and the creation of non-elected people's assemblies that are then going to run things.
Yeah, I mean, the devolution agenda is sort of an archetypal sleight of hand, isn't it? Because you've got a situation whereby the devolution arrangements, would you believe it, that Keir Starmer had the nerve to say it, to use the phrase associated with Brexit, which is take back control, and he called it the Take Back Control Bill. And very often it's posed that, oh yes, Westminster and central government have got too much power. We understand that you, ordinary people, want more power, and we're going to take the power out of Westminster. But what they then mean is give it to regional and local, regional assemblies, create more mayors, new devolved settlements. And I'm originally from Wales, and I can tell you that this notion that, for example, when Wales got devolution, that the political power would be closer to you because you'd have a Welsh Senate, a Welsh government. Actually, what happened, and what is very clear, is that they just became, as it were, the Welsh mafia. That if you were in Wales, you could never get past. I mean, it became a kind of even more distressingly frustrating situation where you didn't take back control, but where the people who were really controlling your lives might have been locally based, but you couldn't negotiate your way around. And ironically, you often want a national body to do that, but it's far preferable to a local one. And we've seen some of the scandals recently in relation to local councils covering up, for example, the grooming gangs, just because it's been in the news, the rape gangs, as people are saying. But saying, oh look, well the local council will sort it out. It's better than a national inquiry, is a way of actually closing down the debate, not opening it up in any way, because there is a group of people locally who've got no interest necessarily in revealing what's been happening in their localities. So yeah, I'm very conscious of the problems of the devolution agenda and the cancellation of those elections. Again, all these things can be explained technically. I mean, that's the way they deal with it. I mean, there is a technical reason why you could say that they are postponing the election and it will save money. But your instincts are absolutely right, which is that this then denies a democratic vote in a local area. And at the moment, we're in a situation where there is an obvious situation where the mainstream parties are frightened of the new insurgent Reform Party getting too many votes, so it suits them to postpone any electoral, recognition of that. You will also, I know, been following what's been happening with things like LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, and 15-minute cities. All of those are kind of local initiatives, right? So it looks as though they've come out of the local area, and therefore local elections, I mean, they might well have a broader reach, but nonetheless, it's the local administrations that have to be held to account for that. So postponing the elections locally is a real problem for people because they can't make their views felt.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying all that. And you and I don't agree about what the role of the WF and stuff, right? But I mean, the government are still developing CBDCs, which the Tories started. They're still putting in developing digital IDs, and the Children's and Homeschool Bill will give children their own individual ID. Nobody asks for this. And then the LTNs are part of the Agenda 2030, because which comes from the C40 network, which is a global network. But anyway, putting that to one side, I do want you to comment on the grooming gangs, and I'm going to say it. I'm Pakistani, I'm Muslim, I'm a child protection social worker. The Pakistani grooming gangs, and what's your take on what do you think's been going on?
Well, I mean, it's obviously been a long-running scandal, and I think the thing that's really shocking about this, just in terms of anyone who's been following it, is that every time a report has come out over the last 10, 15 years, or some newspaper headline has captured the horrors of what's been happening in local areas in relation to the grooming of particularly young white girls, often in care homes, very often people who the state therefore had responsibility to care for, by the way. Every time a report came out, even some of the reports which are now being described as whitewashes, like the Telford report, which is the last one I read, I think, I'd always think that the dam was about to break and that everybody would be so shocked that something would happen. And then it would just stop. There'd be a couple of days of headlines and then it would stop. So I think what has happened is that the dam is slightly unstoppable now. But anyway, in terms of what I think has been happening, I think that quite straightforwardly, a combination of factors that largely centre around the state agencies feeling that they could not intervene in this situation because it would cause too much political trouble, that there would be community relations would be compromised. The kind of cliche now is somebody would call you a racist if you intervened. And because these young white girls who were the victims were not people who anyone anywhere gave any regard to, and they were, we can say that the people who were perpetrating the rapes and the sexual abuse thought of them as white trash, not, as people who were just, you didn't need to, they really were just commodities to be passed around. They had no regard for them, which was partly a form of racism itself. Sections of the Muslim community, sections rather than the whole, of course, sections of the Muslim community just thought that, any white girl, any girl that doesn't cover themselves completely, is fair game, and these white girls were there for their use. That it was also the case that the people in positions of authority in schools, in social services, in the police also thought that they were beyond the pale, right? And that's why so many times we've read that people in authoritative positions would say, well, they really wanted it, they had nothing else going on in their lives, so they were consenting, they took the alcohol freely, they hung out with these guys, it gave them a bit of glamour in their lives. I mean, to a certain extent, there's a truth to some of that, but then they accepted as a consequence of that therefore they weren't people who were victims. They were the wrong kind of victims. And at the same time that those young women were being abused whole scale, wide scale, in certain areas in the country, again, parts of the country which the establishment also were neglecting, areas, towns that the left behind towns in many ways, right? It were already broadly kind of written off as like, deadbeat areas. And then deadbeat girls in deadbeat areas, who's going to give a damn about that, right? While that was going on, we had a huge, not moral panic, but a huge debate, an obsessive debate about Me Too, in which we were told that the Me Too movement proved that women were constantly victimized in workplaces and everywhere they went by male into violence, or and so on and so forth. And the reason I mentioned the Me Too movement was because it started off as being about serious sexual assault at work, or serious sexual interference in people and harassment, to becoming everybody saying Me Too, Me Too. And the Me Too movement was the kind of middle class feminist version of complaining about men putting their hand on your knee, chatting you up, saying the wrong thing. So it relativized what real sexual violence was. While that was going on, some of us, I being one of them, women, would say, what about the victims of the child grooming gangs in the northwest of England, right? And they'd roll their eyes and basically say, oh, you want to introduce that racist agenda. In other words, they wanted to talk about women as victims, but they meant women like us. They actually were complicit in ensuring, because the Me Too movement would have been the perfect time, if you want, to have really drawn attention to the grooming gangs, because the reports were beginning to come out then, and the police officers, the prosecutions were known, but nobody wanted to talk about it. So it's that double standard, that really drove me mad. So I'm really pleased to see it receiving the kind of attention it needs to. And of course, it's causing some real consternation for the Labour Party, who are now in government, who were very often the people who are leading the councils. Most of the areas that are affected by the grooming gangs that we know of, I think it's now 50 towns that we know where these incidents have been happening, are Labour-run councils. And so it's very embarrassing for them, because that means that at the most official levels, they've been looking the other way.
Yeah. Cliff, thank you so much for what you said, because I think it's really, really important for you and I, as people from the left, or that left-wing legacy, right, who've opposed race and racism, to actually say, no, wait a minute, this was, and you haven't said it explicitly, but it's there implicitly. I think I heard it. These definite sexual crimes, definite crimes of class, because the children in care homes are the most distressed, disenfranchised demographic of all. No family to turn to. Families are disenfranchised, chaotic households. And then definitely a racial crime, where you had one group, one particular racial demographic, deliberately targeting another racial demographic. And people are afraid to call it out for what it is. Now, these are racial crimes, crimes of class, and sexual crimes. And the crimes of class that's emphasized by what you said about how the Me Too movement, the middle class guardianistas, regarded this. No, we don't want to go there because then we're racist. No, you call out sexual abuse regardless of who's doing it.
Yeah, and I think, it sort of all coincided with the rise of, or our awareness of, whatever about the rise of, our awareness of the growing problems of radical Islamism in the UK. Post 7/7. I think it's worth crediting Charlie Peters from GB News, one of the reporters who's helped bring this to attention in the recent couple of years. But anyway, in his documentary, he asked the question. One of the reports, kind of disappeared from view, or wasn't even published, or the investigations were closed down around the time of 7/7. And 7/7 was obviously the first really big Islamist atrocity on the UK, when so many people were killed in the London Tube, following on from 9/11 and so on. And the reason I'm saying that is because the establishment's response to some of the rise of Islamist terrorism has been to immediately think, I can't even believe that I'm having to say this, but they'd immediately think, oh my God, there's been a terrible Islamist bomb gone off, this might lead to Islamophobic backlash. That's their first instinct, right? They think, oh, keep the lid on it, because you know what those white working class people are like. They might all become racist if we let this get out of hand. And that's what the response has been throughout. I remember after the Manchester Arena bomb, when they were, the song was, uh, Don't Look Back in Anger, right? And they were kind of trying to keep the lid on everything. They kept saying, we've got to be careful that there isn't an unfair backlash. Now, of course, it would be absolutely inappropriate if there was a racist backlash. But of course, what's likely to create a racist backlash is if you don't allow an open conversation about the very specific nature of what the problem is. And when it comes to, for example, radical Islamism, guess what? The people involved in radical Islamism are Muslims. That does not mean that every Muslim is going to be attracted to the nihilistic violence of radical Islam. That's true. Well, you've got to be able to have the conversation. You've got to be able to say in relation to the grooming gangs, not that it's a part of a general problem of child sexual abuse. There's problems with child sexual abuse, that's one thing. This was a very particular and specific gang approach, collective approach by a group of predominantly Pakistani men to white girls, right? There's no point saying, yes, but what about Catholic priests? They've also abused children. Yes, well, that's why we know that there was a Catholic Church abuse scandal, right? We called it for what it was. We called it the Catholic Church abuse scandal. That didn't mean that the only people who's ever abused a child are Catholic priests. And it also didn't mean that every Catholic priest was an abuser, right? But we did understand it was a particular problem in the Catholic Church or in the Church of England or what have you, right? And this is a particular type of offence for very specific reasons. So it's one of the reasons why the Labour government at the moment are under so much pressure, because they've tried to say, oh, we've already looked at this. We've got the J report, which is a very general, broad report that does not specifically look at the grooming gangs. It just doesn't take into account the specifics of that particular form of offending. And never mind the offending, the big thing for me is the cover-up. I think you have to ask why state employees, people who work for organisations, allowed this to happen on their watch. I mean, I do understand why people didn't whistleblow, because they'd lose their jobs, they'd lose their careers, they'd lose their reputations. But that's the story, isn't it? Why people did not feel able to speak out. Why, somebody raised the point, never mind anything else, why people in sexual health clinics and in the NHS were not noticing the number of young girls who were developing sexual diseases. But of course it was partly because, as a consequence of being regularly raped, right? Presumably because it was like, there was a prejudice underneath that not only did the perpetrators think that they were all sluts, but it's possible that other people thought that too in official positions. And when they were then told about what was really going on, they thought, do I really want to go around and offend the local Pakistani community who also run the council and are quite senior in the police? And, I don't want anyone to think that I'm one of those racisty types who talks about, and so on and so forth. So it's a murky mess, and it's a really distasteful and shocking story of our times, I'm afraid.
It is, and I want to add something to what you're saying, right? And it's so funny, Claire, because I think broadly you and I are of the same polity, right? But there's a little bit, I don't agree with you there, or let me add this or whatever, right? So one is, I've been a child protection social worker for 12 years. Now, I'm not from the same Pakistani demographic that you have in northern Britain. And those are largely Mirpuris, which is for part of Kashmir. We have very close-knit communities. My parents were Mahajers. They came from India to Lahore, very middle class, different class demographic. So then I'm not connected to that community in the same way. Plus, while I went to university in Bradford to study for my social work degree, I didn't grow up in Bradford. I grew up in London, and now I live in the southeast of England, not in one of those towns. I've never, and I've worked for 14 different local authorities, I've never ever been in a situation where a manager or another social worker or I have ever been told we cannot investigate this child abuse that's going on because of we don't want to offend any racial or ethnic sensibility. Never, ever, ever. What I think may have happened, and I'm speculating here, is, a social worker comes across this, passes it on to the manager, because I always feedback the case that I'm working on. If it's serious, it goes to the manager's manager, and if it's really, really serious, all the way up to the director of children's services, and it just keeps going up through the lines of accountability. And at some point, someone in that chain of accountability said, don't investigate this because of some made-up reason. Interpol are investigating, Special Branch or MI5, or it's much larger operation. And then that message goes down to the frontline social worker. Okay, I'll leave alone. And they don't know. And then I don't buy I think the idea that they didn't want to offend racial sensibilities is a smokescreen. They don't want to offend Muslim sensibilities because the British imperial government has offended enough Muslim sensibilities by the number of Muslims that it's killed in Pakistan and Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan, and the wars that it's waged against the Muslim world, and the numbers of people that they've killed, the complete destruction of Libya, the unnecessary war against Iraq. So I think of it as a smokescreen, and I think it's more to do with complicity with people that had power within that local authority area. Senior police officers, councillors, senior social workers, managers, who I think were bought and captured because just as Epstein has showed us, and P. Diddy, that whole thing will show us, is that it's a great way of capturing people and owning them, because nobody can own up to that.
Yeah, but I disagree with that. I don't think it's anything to do with Epstein, or I don't think it's part of that pattern. But where you're right on Muslim sensitivities are not wishing to offend is for completely different reasons. Because precisely in the way that you explained it, it's not a don't we love Muslims question. It's to do with the particular policy decisions that were taken here about dealing with immigration and the emergence of multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is very different to multi-ethnicity. In other words, you can have a multi-ethnic society in which you are indifferent to the ethnicity of people who live in a country as long as they support the aims of the country that they live in. That's one thing. So when I say support, I don't mean sign up loyalty to every single policy. That would be authoritarian. But that broadly speaking, identify and see themselves as British. But multiculturalism was an attempt at managing immigration by encouraging people to identify with their ethnicity, their religion, their different identity groups. And that has been entirely negative, entirely divisive, and has created, the cliche parallel communities in lots of different ways. And it was that management of things. I mean, if you in those northern towns, the way that democracy is done is anti-democratic, because what you get is, instead of treating every single person who lived in the area, for example, as an individual who you were trying to persuade to vote for you, say you were standing in an election, you would go and talk to community leaders, right? And this wasn't just Muslim communities; it would be Sikh community leaders, and everybody started to get parceled off. And by the way, that has grown out of the ethnicity groups into other identity groups. So now you cannot have a public policy without somebody saying, but have we talked to the trans community? Have we talked to the disabled community? Have we talked to and so on and so forth. So everybody starts to be lose their individual capacity to control society and be part of blocks. And those community leaders, those leaders that are then considered to be stakeholders. And if you look at any policy that goes through, when I'm in the House of Lords, they say, we've consulted stakeholders. They then are given an unelected role of speaking on behalf of the community they represent and given undue power. And that, I think, is really problematic. And we just saw that, has seen that, the dangers of that with something like the grooming gangs.
Yeah, which matches what happens with a lot of electoral politics in Pakistan, where certain rural areas like in the Punjab and the Sindh, the landlord will just tell everybody who to vote for.
Yeah. I mean, it's feudal, right? It's feudal at that level. It's pre-democratic, and it's not. It's a very dangerous situation to be in, where those attitudes to how you decide on what's going on in a local area or in national politics is decided as against the individual wishes of each voter. That's why I started off by saying, at the ballot box, each person has their vote and you're equal, and it doesn't matter whether you're, sweeping the streets or you're, somebody who owns a manor house, right? Everybody is equal at that ballot box. That is the basis of democracy. But these are anti-democratic trends. And of course, the reason why the ruling elites don't panic is because they've been ring fencing off. I mean, that's exactly what being in the EU is like. You don't have to bother with those pesky voters and asking what they think, because you've got people who know best. And so you can gather together the people who are experts in issues and make decisions, and then tell the electorate, this is what we've decided on your behalf. And so that trend was already in existence, which meant that they felt far more at ease dealing with the community leader in Oldham. Never mind the council. The council felt better dealing with the community leader than having to go and talk to every single person in the local area to get their support. Because then they might, then there's too many of them. It's such a pain, democracy. I mean, democracy is a pain, by the way. I mean, one can always understand why authoritarianism is appealing, because there's lots of times that the electorate do things that I don't like. And you do think, oh, God, wouldn't it be much easier if the world could be run through my image? You know what I mean?
That's
I know
right,
what you
that's
should do. I'll tell them what to do. And so
I agree with you on that one, Claire. I agree with you on that one.
So they get carried away with themselves, and they rather like it. But anyway.
That's right. No, I absolutely agree with you. And just as a Muslim born of Shia and Sunni parents, whose wife is Christian, whose brother is an Islamic scholar and married to a Jewish woman, and I go to Quaker meetings, then trust me, just I'll work it out for everybody. It'll all be good.
Yeah.
Quakers, I'm not a Quaker, but Quakers just do good.
But you have just illustrated precisely why this whole groupthink is such a nonsense, right? Because you, as a demographic, right, would be represented by the leader of the Muslim community as a demographic, right? And they would speak for you. No, and it's always more complicated, right? It's more complicated than that, right? How can they do that? I always think anyone who says, speaking on behalf of women, I think you're not speaking on behalf of me, right? I mean, it's more complicated. I've got it's complicated.
Well, I promise to speak on behalf of Welsh women. How about that?
I'll narrow it down, but then it becomes anyway.
Yes. Now you said about the challenges of democracy. I mean, there's a challenge for us as Britons that we are in effect it seems like a democratic tyranny, because their leadership is so unassailable, and there is no dissent. Because one of the things that happened, why I said that the Rishi Sunak was going to do such an awful job deliberately to hand Keir Starmer this massive majority, is what it did is it got rid of about 100 or so liberty-loving Tories in the sort of traditional sense. And my measure for that is the vote against the vaccine mandates, where you had, I think there were 8 opposition MPs that voted against that, including Jeremy Corbyn and Caroline Lucas. But you had about 100 Tory MPs that voted against that. That's what I consider to be state overreach, where the state says, follows the sort of policies that Mengele would have been happy with. But that's all gone now. And Keir Starmer has purged his, by the way, I use that name deliberately, has purged the party of any liberty-loving left-wing members like Corbyn, the assault on Diane Abbott, and what we have are now central party blow-ins, central office blow-ins.
The thing that I don't think is remotely deliberate, for a start off, and that's democracy for you. The Conservative Party imploded. You can say there was 100 people who voted against mandate. I mean, the Conservatives imposed lockdown on us, right? And they didn't, and there was very little. I mean, I was fighting the Conservatives on a lot of these questions, and they behaved abysmally, and they were backed, yes, by enthusiastic, overzealous Labour members, but they didn't need any encouragement, let me tell you. I think that what happened at the last election was a righteous result from the point of view that people were absolutely furious with what the Conservative Party had failed to do or had done, and they went to the ballot box and they acted accordingly. And we know that the Labour government's grasp on popular support is thin, because it didn't get overwhelming numbers in terms of votes, but it certainly got the result which, to a certain extent, the electorate wanted. They wanted to thrash and humiliate and destroy the Conservative Party. I think that the Labour Party, it's been a long time since the Labour Party has had any freedom-loving. It's been quite a long time. I mean, you mentioned Corbyn and Diane Abbott. I mean, Corbyn, hardly in my view.
It's the best that we've got. We don't have.
no,
There's
I
no
know, but I mean
heavyweights
that's
anymore, like Tony
pathetic.
Benn.
All I'm saying is there's been an abandonment of any association between the left and liberty for many years in the Labour Party, and so the professionalisation under Keir Starmer is entirely what one would anticipate. To be fair, because that's what the Labour Party post Blair anyway has become. A kind of, as I've already said, a technocratic ideology like party. Um, what you can do about it is you have to campaign to have first of all a bottom up grassroots resistance to what those aspects of government policy that you disagree with, which is what we've traditionally always done in order to shift the dial, and also ensure that parties that you want or the individuals you want might put through. And I think it is remarkable that in a first past the post system at the last election that Reform got 5 MPs. And also the case that the independents, Corbyn being one of them, that there was 5 of those. I mean, I'm not enthusiastic about those individuals because I have a particular take on the Israel-Gaza situation. I would be on the opposite side to them. But I nonetheless, that's a breakthrough in a way that 10 members of the House of Commons were elected for beyond the mainstream party rubric, right? They kind of broke through, which I think is I mean, in a first past the post system, it's almost like impossible. So I think that we can see the political realignment and political shake-up happening in the UK, and I think it's likely to become more profound and likely to continue in that trajectory. And that's why reform. It's not that I'm an enthusiastic supporter of reform, but I'm delighted to see a vehicle for populist discontent to emerge, and that's the way I see them. And I think that the opinion polls are telling, that the Labour Party are not retaining the support of the country.
No.
And we started off by, or you started off, and I think we met on one of the farmers' gatherings in London. I think the farmers' dispute just about sums up for me where Labour get it so wrong and why they are so incompetent at present. Because in their heads, they genuinely believe that they were taking on, big landowners, and they kind of use that kind of old trope of the kind of rich landowning elite, and that they were going to tax them in terms of the inheritance tax. They kind of had in their mind as well the kind of blow-ins like Jeremy Clarkson, he's only in it for the money and the fame. It's not really serious farmers. And they introduced a bill which is now going to destroy family farming, right? I mean, it's like unbelievable. And now they're trapped. They don't quite know how to get out because in their head they have this sort of superficial, cliche-ridden notion of who they're attacking. And they did exactly the same, by the way, with the pensioners. For them, they thought, oh, well, lots of young people are really resentful of these kind of rich pensioners who've kind of done all right and are neglecting young people, And they thought that there would be some sympathy for going for the winter fuel allowance against those who could afford it, never anticipating this was to draw in tens of thousands of pensioners, and that the British population would be appalled that they were forcing those people to have to choose between eating and heating and so on and so forth. All of these things, they've done exactly the same with private schools. They tried to VAT. Oh, they're those rich people who send their kids to private schools, not really considering the possibility that a lot of people who send their kids to private schools is because the state school is not up to the task, or because their children are special needs, or that they felt that they needed a particular type of school to send their kids to, and then the really rich people were not going to be too fazed by the fee increase at Eton, but the people who really struggle to send their kids to the local private school would be more ordinary people, and that lots of these kind of private schools anyway are not just private schools in a kind of public school posh sense, but arrangements beyond the control of the state in terms of different kind of schooling, privately organised, were going to be affected. So they managed to absolutely irritate the hell out of huge, and not just irritate, but infuriate huge sections of society, because everywhere you look, they have created an enemy. I mean, it's remarkable. In just over 6 months, they have created so many different types of enemies. Parents in relation to schooling, farmers, pensioners in relation to the grooming gangs, are kind of like the populist Northwest. You know what I mean? Like there's like all these like, oh my God, is there anyone that they have not alienated? And they're only just started to introduce their bills. Imagine what it's going to be like after a year, right? So they are creating the seeds of their own destruction.
Yes, and just on that last point, like they've just started. I mean, unless there's some way of peacefully, legally, lawfully deposing this government, I don't know how awful the country is going to look in 2029. Especially you mentioned beforehand that you don't think. I think before we started recording about the climate and nature bill would go through, but looking at, so I haven't read the bill. I've seen summaries of the bill and what it might portend, but that's just awful, absolutely awful. This, we'll be deprived of energy. We're going to be deprived of food. We're going to be.
Yeah, I don't think it's stated. I don't think it's a government bill. That's the thing. So it's a question of
private members bill.
I don't think it's going to. Pardon?
It's a private members bill, I think.
Yeah, but a private members bill. I mean, anyone can get a private members bill. Yeah, a private members bill is, but that's precisely what I mean. It's not hasn't got the status. That just means that an MP has put it forward, and some private members bills, but very rarely, get picked up by the government. And if you saw the private members bills that get discussed, if you thought that was the way the country's going to be given, you'd give up, right? Because they're like completely off the wall. So I agree. I mean, I've looked at the bill, and if it were to be taken seriously by the government, it would be frightening, but it's not one that I think is the biggest threat. I mean, I just retweeted it. It's not like I'm not saying we should take any notes of it, but we should also know that. But, I think it's worth noting that sometimes private members' bills are picked up, and that's what happened with the assisted dying bill. And that was another bill, or that's another example of where they've alienated people. I think that Keir Starmer really was thoughtless enough to have gone along with promising Esther Ranson a celebrity, thinking it would be popular to do this. And actually, assisted dying is very popular. I mean, that's one thing that has been true for a very long time. I've always opposed assisted dying, but the majority of my fellow countrymen and women would disagree with me. It's had a popular appeal, and people see it as a question of choice and autonomy. I disagree with them, but one can't but note that, I can't be dishonest, I haven't convinced the majority of people to agree with me. The thing that was really interesting about the private members bill and the way that was dealt with was that that Keir Starmer tried to, the cabinet, or specifically Starmer, I suppose, tried to say, "Oh no, we're not bringing this bill forward. This is just a private members bill, but we'll give it some airtime." Yeah, and obviously we know. So that was a way of not looking as though they were pushing it, but just allowing it to happen. There's been more of a backlash against that, I think, than Starmer thought there would be. It's a very, very poorly written bill. Even within those people who would support assisted dying were anxious about it. And although they tried to say it was very limited in scope, it actually has got so many loopholes. It's going to go through. I mean, that bill is being passed. It's now just got to be. It's got to go through some procedures, but it's very difficult to actually stop it at this stage, although it can be amended and improved. But that whole issue actually, interestingly, drew a lot more attention to assisted dying and made many people I know who were for assisted dying change their mind, which is just fascinating. It had the opposite effect, in a way, of what they maybe anticipated, because it drew attention to an issue people hadn't really thought about in huge depth, and consequently, more and more people are now very worried about that bill. But you keep asking what's going to happen. If they, I mean, that is the price of democracy, right? That you vote for a government, and you are, when I say stuck with that government, you're stuck with that government. What you can do, and what changes politicians' minds, or even if it doesn't change their mind, it changes the course of their action, is when there is a big public opinion shift. That's undoubtedly what happens. Is they are anxious. They look over their shoulders at the electorate a fair bit, and if you can build a movement around a particular issue, they can back off a little. That's what happens, and that is what the point of demonstrations is. The point of grassroots campaigning. The point of the farmers over the last few days, I think, have been having local and regional protests all around the country in various places. And, it's quite interesting that Morrison's, the supermarket chain, has come out backing the farmers and publicly, and also has revealed that it's been trying to lobby the government, right? So you've got this sort of weird situation whereby if it becomes untenable, it makes it much harder for them to implement in the way that they'd anticipated implementing things like the farmers' inheritance back provision. So I think that we just have to keep going. We have to keep trying on something like and the other thing I wanted to say was not everything is about the law. I mean, this is quite important. Like, for example, I am concerned that too many people think that the way that we should fight for free speech gains is constantly to put forward legal challenges. And there's a lot of lawfare going on both sides, right? But, as it were, our side, the free speech side, are constantly going to court and trying to highlight things through the court. And I'm full of admiration for that. And the Free Speech Union in particular deserves credit, but there are others for taking things to court, and trying to clarify around the law. It's just that I don't want my free speech rights to be determined by the law courts and the judges. That's one aspect of it. What you have to do is to build a culture of free speech.
Yeah.
And many people don't agree with us. I mean, you can say that, I'm constantly talking both at schools and universities. A lot of people disagree on free speech. A lot of people supported the Online Safety Act, right? Because they thought it was, they want to be protected from offence. They're worried about their kids being exposed to things. There's all sorts of panics that go on, but it's not just panics, but it would be right. It wasn't as though the free speech, the Online Safety Act was brought in against what the population wanted. I mean, the population, broadly speaking, supported it, right? Sections didn't, but lots of people did. If you were to have had a referendum, they might well have won. And so it seems to me, and that's what I try and do with the work that we do at the Academy of Ideas, is you have to build culture change. You have to persuade people. Low traffic neighbourhoods, all of these things, just to use that as an example, there are lots of people who support low traffic neighbourhoods. You have to persuade people. You can't just assert that because we know we're right, that we have the populace on our side. That's not always the case. And I think sometimes we can get complacent, blame the government. I blame the government, but we have to have these arguments out with our fellow citizens so that there are mass demonstrations on the streets, or so that there is much more support for what you or I might say, rather than just hoping that or assuming that because we're right and we've got a kind of a bit of a campaign that we've got everyone else on board. I mean, that's to be fair, just kidding ourselves that we've won the arguments, and I'm not sure that we have.
Okay, Claire, that's so refreshing. It's so refreshing. You and I haven't agreed on certain issues, and but I think in terms of the importance of the freedom of speech, because this is how we'll learn from each other, by having debates with people that we don't agree with, because then there's a chance of me persuading somebody else and of learning from somebody else as well, and that's how we have progress. So absolutely on that. And then the other thing, the importance of demonstrating and building a movement. I was regularly in London on the pro-freedom, anti-lockdown marches, and I think that did have an effect because it did spread the word and bypass media, the mainstream media, which didn't hardly cover them. In terms of lawfare, I think it's important that we use whatever peaceful, lawful means there are. So some people are going to go to court and go that way. Some people are going to walk in the streets. And then one of the things that I just want to make slight mention of, a couple of things, if I may, with you, right, and then we can finish up, is one is that and I don't want to go into international politics with you. I don't think we have the time here, right? But I take a Quakerish position on them. That the government is breaking its own statutes, the International Criminal Court Act 2001 and the Terrorism Act. Those statutes define what genocide is, define war crimes, crimes against humanity, and terrorism. And it's a criminal offense to fund or facilitate any of those activities. And the government and its agents, including its military and quasi-military agencies, are not exempted from those provisions of those activities. So if a farmer pays inheritance tax, and some of that money is being used to facilitate those activities, then that farmer could be guilty of a criminal offence. And I've actually gone through the provisions and looked at the provisions. There's an organisation, probitycode.com, set up by an anti-war campaigner. And it's also illegal. This would make sense if I said to you, hey, Claire, I'm raising money for some prescribed terrorist organisation. Will you give me money? Well, I'm committing a criminal offence if I'm asking for funds, some of which go towards those activities. So there may be instances like that where people can use existing statutes, and then certainly the farmers could try, because it's worth a shot. What else have they got to lose? Because what's at stake is far too important. Then the other thing that I want to bring mention to is the 1689 Bill of Rights, which is still in effect, which sets up Parliament as our representatives and says, I'm paraphrasing slightly, that Parliament cannot pass laws that are to the majority of the people, and that these rights are for perpetuity. And because it's set up Parliament, my understanding is that it can't be changed by Parliament.
But it's also got no legal standing. So I mean, it's wishful thinking to hope that we had a First Amendment, which we don't have.
It's still on the government website. Legislation.
No, I know, but it's not. Yeah, but it's just an abstract notion. It's not the same as the force of law in the modern world. You can cite it, but I think that's what I mean. It's like first of all, I mean, I think we probably would very much disagree on international affairs. I don't think that's the way the farmer should go. But I do think that the point about one of the things that the people want to do all the time is or to imagine that our rights are enshrined somewhere, and people will cite the UN Charter on Human Rights in relation to free speech, or they'll cite the European Court of Human Rights in relation to free speech and say, look, it's written down. And of course, my immediate thing is, well, first of all, those are internationally, I would say that they are unhelpful in terms of determining sovereign law for a start-up. But secondly, there's always exemptions. And what I would try to say about the lawfare question is, I don't want to be in a situation whereby our rights are defined legalistically like that. Which is not to say, I agree that lawfare is a perfectly honourable pursuit, but I think people can become overly preoccupied with trying to get our rights defined in a written form, rather than the much harder task, which is to create a culture of freedom and free speech. I just do not think, I think that's much harder to achieve, that you have to be able to create an atmosphere in which people believe it is better to live in a free society, in which one take the risk of free speech, because obviously free speech is risky. I mean, it's like people are not wrong when they say Musk, has opened up X in a way that you've got less censorship, but which it's become a sewer, right? You kind of do see things that you think, bloody hell, right? It's not always pleasant, you would prefer to manicure the kind of freedom you had, but with freedom comes. It's not responsibility in that usual way, but with freedom there is a burden, which is you have to choose things, and people sometimes, if we're honest, prefer somebody else to do it, right? And the limits on free speech are often, free speech for me, but not for thee. They kind of like want they like the notion of free speech, but they don't want that lot to have it, or that lot to have it, or that lot to have it. And by the way, that includes even people in the free speech side, right? Because I have found that too often people who are pro free speech seem to be really great, are just itching to cancel somebody on the kind of progressive woke left. They kind of can't wait for some boycott that they can implement themselves. Well, these are double standards, right? You have to be consistent. You cannot argue for free speech and then try and curtail the free speech of your enemies. I mean, that is no use, right? You have to be prepared to put up with the consequences of free speech, which is to have to engage and tangle with those people whose views you despise, even the free speech of those who try and use free speech to cancel our free speech. I mean, that's the deal, right? And then you have to win some arguments. And my view is that we are not good enough at winning our own arguments. I don't think that there is enough debate or discussion, that too many people on the free speech side even are in echo chambers, ourselves, right? And where we need to get out more, just like we say they do, right? We need to get out more. We have to encounter more arguments. We have to not caricature our opponents. We have to really listen to what they're saying and take it seriously, just as we would demand they do of us. What is it you're actually saying? Engage with it, and so on and so forth. Because I think that there's a broader trend of people backing off from political engagement. And one of the reasons why the Academy of Ideas runs its Battle of Ideas Festival and all of the work that we try and do is to set up situations whereby there's more discussion and debate, open public conversation on these questions, and show a little bit of humility and think that possibly we don't have the answers, but we're freeing up the space in which we can, as grown-ups, debate what the big questions are and then argue over the answers, but not assume that we know before we start.
Yes, Claire, that's so refreshing and so great what you said. It's absolutely. You've got to be pro free speech. I remember this conversation between George Galloway and Nigel Farage, and I thought, oh, there's going to be fireworks here. There's going to be fireworks. It was about Brexit, and then I was like, oh my god, it was just a civil debate, a civil conversation. And that's where we get to learn. That's where we get to grow. So absolutely. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to say before we finish up?
No, I suppose, we should have more courage and be less complacent about our own side.
Yes.
That's what I'd say. And thank you for inviting me on. And I hope, like people follow you and sign up to your offering. I also hope that people will check out the Academy of Ideas and our Substack usual stuff. And also, one thing is, I do think, when you were just saying about the climate change bill, one thing is that one obligation I think everybody in the UK has is to keep their eye on what's happening in Parliament and go beyond the headlines and actually find out what's going on. One thing I try and do is every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I do this thing called Inside the Lords, where I try and explain what's happening inside the Lords, a neglected part of Parliament, in as much as, the Lords should be abolished, by the way, it's completely anti-democratic, but that's not the point. The point is, while it's there as a legislative body, people should find out what it's getting up to. But I do think that we probably need to be informed and find out for ourselves what's really happening in Parliament, because there's a lot of things that are, sometimes hit the headline and they're not really the biggest problem. So anyway, keep in touch with me, and good luck with your endeavours too.
Claire, thank you so much. I was just going to say, when you said about we got to have more courage, I did for a minute think you were going to say, for a second, you're going to have more curry. So I think we're going to have more curry. We've got to have more courage as well, and we've got to be informed. I'll have the links in the description below, so the Academy of Ideas and your X and your Substack. And for anybody who's watching, you have any comments or questions, please put them in the description below. Please share this far and wide. And between now and when I see you next, please keep filling your pockets with freedom and with honor and with peace. This is Rich and Claire signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.